Well, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Family Matters, and thanks to everyone who's been tuning in and sending messages and feedback. Incredibly appreciated. So thank you. Look, we'd have to have been hiding under a rock to not have noticed even the US presidential elections of late. And I thought, particularly wanting to reflect on those results and what it means for the pro-life movement. Where were the wins? Were there losses? Does the campaign have an impact one way or another? And so I thought the best person to bring on to have a chat around these things is Brendan Malone, a wonderful, cultural commentator. So Brendan, welcome to the show.
Simon, it's great to be back. Always enjoy our conversation, so it's good to be back.
Yeah, well, as I was reflecting on the US elections, look, we could literally spend hours talking about it, but it was really that pro-life side which then made me think of you because, of course, you are highly involved in this space in terms of research and advocacy and training both here and overseas. And I thought there was no one better to talk about it. And really the main angle is, what have we learned for pro-lifers through the US election? So maybe, if I could, to start there, the election, to me, particularly from the Democrat side, Kamala Harris was really big on the whole reproductive rights issues. Should we be reading anything in the pro-life space into her loss?
Well, I think so. And I think there's some interesting things that happened here. One is they really did bank on there being a majority, particularly of women, and particularly probably of white women, who would turn out on the abortion issue. The whole Handmaid's Tale scaremongering and everything else, they really did pour it on thick. But in actual fact, it turns out that did not happen. And so the question is, well, why didn't it happen? Why didn't they win on the back of really beating the abortion drums? And I think there's a couple of aspects to this. One is clearly a lot of women and a lot of people, including men, were not fooled by this nonsense. They understood the issue, and I think they thought they could just scaremonger them into it, and that didn't work. And then I think also the reality is that there are serious pressing issues around American society right now with things like the open border crisis. They've got a very serious issue there. With the cost of living and inflation, it's just off the charts, and it really does stem back to the previous administration. And so people clearly wanted those other issues fixed. And I think that's something important to keep in mind, that if you're going to be a pro-life candidate in the political space, I think you've actually got to address the whole suite of the human experience. You can't just come with that one policy. You've got to actually have concrete solutions. And also, it's fair to say, Trump spoke very robustly as well at times. I was quite surprised, during the debates where he just enunciates a very strong opposition to abortion. He didn't try and sort of hedge his bets at all. I thought he might have this time around, and it didn't really hurt him at all. So I think there's a lesson in that's for sure. You can have courage on the issue.
Yeah, many points to tease out. I think you're right on the whole point of actually both for the, if you will, the pro-choice and the pro-life side, that actually if you're going to have that viewpoint, it does need to be buttressed or surrounded by a whole lot of other wider issues. I wrote a little while back, and I'm sure you've commentated on it as well. A lot of people are motivated when it comes to elections on things like the economy, health, law and order. As you said, in America, a big focus on the border. But is it then, particularly with the Democrats, when I think of Harris, she just not only doubled, but tripled down on reproductive rights. It was almost the only thing, Brendan, that she seemed to talk about. Is she so ideologically captured in your mind? Was she completely ignorant of what the people were saying? Was she caught in a bubble? Why, from your perspective, was she so driven on that topic?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors. One is definitely she is absolutely ideologically captured, and we can see that by the fact that she was really pushing something called the Women's Health Protection Act. She was claiming this was going to be her policy. It is a very extreme pro-abortion policy that if she had been elected, she would have passed. And she also wanted to destroy the filibuster, which means that you can have the tyranny of the slim majority. You only need 51 votes to completely introduce this law that is actually far worse than what Roe was, that was overturned. And so she is definitely extreme. She's ideologically captured. But I think also history shows us with Kamala Harris, she is not a great campaigner. And whether it's the staff around her or her inability to read the room and understand things, and clearly they did think this was going to be a winning issue. they thought that they could actually scaremonger people into supporting them based on this Handmaid's Tale fantasy about what abortion was and what was going to happen. And I mean, the claims they were making were just absolutely ludicrous when you looked at them, but they still kept making them. And for some reason during this election cycle, I was constantly reminded of a comment that I read about 12 years ago, I think it was, in an op-ed that was written by the woman who, I don't know if she's even still alive, but she was at the time the head of NARAL, which is their big National Abortion Law Reform Association movement, the really big pro-abortion lobby movement over there. And she wrote this op-ed, and I think it was the Washington Post, and she expressed her dismay. She was on a train. She went to counter-protest the March for Life with a group of her colleagues, and she said she was absolutely dismayed because on that train she was surrounded by a whole lot of young, vibrant women, and they were all there for the pro-life cause. And she said in that op-ed, quite famously or infamously, I realised in that moment I was part of an ageing post-menopausal militia. And I can't help but wonder if that's caught up with Kamala Harris. They are speaking to a tiny demographic who actually are abortion obsessed, and the majority of women are not thinking that way about this issue.
Well, it's been one of the striking things for me then that, be it, again, I mean, here we are in New Zealand talking about what's happening in America and American politics, but you can't help but feel, or maybe I should say I can't help but feel that the media, the polling companies were in that bubble. They cannot have been ignorant of that wider group of people. The focus groups undoubtedly would have been feeding back that this is not the issue, but they just continued to push hard into it. And as you say, it got more and more extreme in the rhetoric. I don't know if it was in that manifesto you mentioned, but she even referenced about forcing medical doctors to participate. They wouldn't have conscience rights. And again, I just can't fathom how a politician could be so caught up in that, if you will, to have avoided the feedback that was clearly coming back through, that this was not the issue.
Well, I think what you've got to understand too is there's a deeper, and I'm quite confident saying this now, there is a progressive religious commitment to abortion. And I really mean that in the true sense. I can tell you what your worship is, what your religious tradition is by what is the object of your love and your dedication and your commitment. And this is one of their objects of dedication and commitment and desire. They throw everything at this. They are really invested in very extreme positions. And so there's a sort of I think you get a religious sort of sense of like a mania that comes upon them as well, because they see abortion, and quite wrongly and falsely, but they would equate it with a form of emancipation. And it's like they almost see it as like their, anti-slavery proclamation where they're all freed from all sorts of awful tyranny and patriarchy and everything else by being able to imitate deadbeat dads who run away from pregnancies. Now, if we can do that too, then we'll be free. And they are so committed to that idea, so wedded to that it takes on like a religious mania. And you don't quite realize at that moment, I think, that it's not simply that they're blinded to reality. It's that there is a commitment that must be upheld. They cannot let this go because it is like religious dogma. It is, as some have described, like a sacrament for them that they must hold on to and protect. And so I think that's a factor in all of this as well.
It's possibly a similar thought, but I've sort of seen it too when people are, pursuing something which I see as completely ethically and morally wrong. I mean, we agree on that. The absurdities required to uphold the position have to become more and more absurd over time. And in the abortion space, it can't just be saying, it's okay in certain circumstances. It's got to get pushed further and further and further. And it's exactly where Harris and the Democrats went. And again,
a great example of that, Simon, was Jimmy Dore, the comedian who's now a podcaster. Great guy. He's more he's liberal, but he describes himself as being pro-choice. But he went to and he's a natural Democrat voter, by the way, too. And he went to the Democratic National Convention, and they were pushing abortion. They had the abortion bus there and all that kind of stuff going on. And he said that he was confronted by a lady who was I don't know if she still is, but she might have been the former producer of Jon Stewart's show, The Daily Show. So this is someone with a bit of pedigree. And she actually remonstrated with him and said, no, it's not good enough to be pro-choice. You have to be pro-abortion. And so you can see there's been a big shift that has crept in. And what they don't realise, I think, is as they've become more pro-abortion, they have pulled away from where probably a lot of people who may not be as well informed on the issue, they sort of sit in the pro-choice space, they are pulling away from them as well.
Oh, 100%. From what I've been able to read and glean coming out of America, the majority of Americans do appear to be pro-choice, but very, very moderate. They would be thinking very extreme cases and the emotive ones that we're all familiar with. But the idea of completely up to birth, that there's no conscience right for doctors, again, the extremes being pushed, they went, whoa, that's just way, way too much. So for what it's worth, in my view, not only did Harris in this case misread the room around what the real issues were, completely overcooked the pro-life issue around abortion. But I suppose the other side too, there's been a little commentary that they also completely misunderstood the transgender debate, that actually a lot of women ended up voting for Trump and the Republicans because actually they did want women's spaces protected, and they saw that the Democrats were completely off the reservation with that.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the new polling in the last few days. They've done a bit more surveying about what was driving people. That, in a lot of places, has actually turned out to be the number one motivating issue for people in their vote. And so that's quite telling. And I think what's happened is this ideology, that normally what happens with an ideology, where you take an idea and you try and make reality fit the idea. So it doesn't start with what is real. It starts with an idea and tries to impose it. And normally what happens is you do this incrementally, and that's how an ideology will take hold in a culture. But what happened with the gender identitarian movement is they have really pushed hard and fast, and they had a whole lot of progressive bureaucrats in key positions who were able to just ram through policy changes and legislations and enforce them upon the whole of society. After initially claiming, oh no, it's just live and let live, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that in actual fact the whole of society had to be reordered to this new false alternate reality. And so they pushed too hard and too fast, and what happened is, because this ideology does not correspond with reality at all, people said, hey, no, we're not buying this. And then once it became apparent that children were being harmed in the process in quite serious and lifelong ways, and women's spaces and the basic sort of protection for women were eroding, and even just like changing rooms and things like that. And then on top of that, when they tried to respond, the other side would just gaslight everyone and say, oh no, it's a false conservative conspiracy. It's not real. You've got nothing to worry about. As, regular article after regular article would appear about some awful incident that was going on in these spaces. And so basically what happened was people said, the dam broke, and people said, we've had enough. And I think what often happens in moments like this, you're probably aware of this, Simon, as someone who's got that pedigree in politics yourself, people will often channel a whole lot of issues through one particular flashpoint. And I think that became a flashpoint. And even within the issue itself, they may be talking about women's spaces, but they do that because they know they have permission to use that terminology. What they also mean is the mutilation of children. They know the idea of imposing something that is anti-science upon reality, all that kind of stuff. But they use the issue of women's spaces as their primary sort of way of talking about it, because they're allowed to. It's publicly acceptable now to have that conversation.
It's one of the striking things I've found actually since the election and the result, that people are actually, even here in New Zealand, more prepared to talk about these issues. And that's not to draw you and I into the politics of the Republican Democrats, but I've been struck that Kiwis who are more prepared to say, actually, we don't mind what Trump's doing, which 4+ years ago was verboten, to talk around the transgender issues and even into abortion and reproductive rights. I mean, better be clear, Brendan, it's not like the first topic of conversation on the street, but people are still more prepared to discuss. So I mean, and it's effectively the Republican victory. So as I keep saying, Trump obviously won the presidential election, but the Republicans have won both the House and the Senate. So a huge rejection, arguably, of the left-wing or progressive agenda. Do you think there's going to be, though, much change in the United States? Are we going to see a concerted or assertive push on areas like abortion, transgenderism, or do you think the Trump administration is just going to sort of hold where things are?
Well, I think they're separate issues. So already he's indicated quite strongly on the issue of women's spaces and women's sports and stuff, where he's lying, and he seems to be making movements already that indicate he's going to act on that particular issue. Abortion, he's also clearly signaled, and I think this is important for people to remember too. Trump is not pro-life. There's this great irony in this man, in that a guy who is actually, and has been for a very long time, for decades now, an avowed pro-choicer, who actually gave the pro-life movement and unborn children and their mothers this profound and, good victory in the overturning of Roe. But he was a president who was not naturally aligned with that view, who actually did what former administrations who are naturally aligned with that view or claim to be, didn't do. So it was kind of, the whole thing's very surreal in a lot of ways, but he is pro-choice. And he's been very clear that from his perspective, he's put it back to the states. And as far as he's concerned, that's the job done for him. So what I don't expect is, I don't expect it to get more extreme. I know some people have signaled, well, what about RFK? RFK is not pro-life, and he has said, I think he says he supports abortion. It's just a woman's choice, typical sort of Democrat position. But I don't see him actually being in a position to shift much in the way of legislation or policy that will have any meaningful impact on where they are now. So I don't expect it to get more extreme. But on the flip side, I don't expect it either to swing more pro-life. However, right now there are some foundational issues that need to be addressed in America. And secondly, there is the looming changes on the Supreme Court, and this could be quite pivotal as a long-term strategy for the pro-life movement. Now, I think also the pro-life movement in America has got to adapt, and some clearly are talking about that, but others, it seems, are still not quite adapting to this new situation on the ground. They have overturned Roe, and now it is clear that in some places they didn't have a ground game ready for that day, and possibly because they were sort of a bit shocked by it all anyway. But now they've got to adjust, and someone, for example, who wrote a really good essay recently, a very lengthy essay called Ryan T. Anderson, and he wrote a very good essay called The Way Forward After Roe. And I think he articulates very well that what pro-lifers have got to start thinking about now is, how do we begin to shift not just legislation itself around abortion, but also related pieces of legislation, so you can actually bit by bit save more and more lives along that process. And so I think that's what they've got to start thinking about now. If the pro-life movement just spends the next 4 years attacking and critiquing Trump every single time he expresses his very typical and long-held pro-choice views, or he doesn't give them what they want, they're not really going to get much further. They need to actually start working on the ground a bit smarter about this. So, and I guess internationally, what does that mean for us? Because there are international ramifications. I think someone the other day put it really well when they said, a lot of this nonsense started in America, and I'm hoping now that the resolution will start to come out of America as well with this change. And so I think that could well be a factor. And so what I expect is you'll start to see other nations with very progressive and extreme ideologies, really sort of running the show. They will really try and double down. Like, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Keir Starmer in the UK came out at the very moment when Trump is trying to bring about peace with the Ukraine conflict. Keir Starmer comes out and says, well, we'll pick up the tab basically, and we'll just make sure that we need to fight even harder in the Ukraine. It's just crazy. You'll probably see that sort of oppositional stuff. And I think abortion, transgenderism, there'll be some of those kind of things that'll go on as well in other nations, including our own.
You've touched on a couple of, and really quickly, key points for me. You're right to identify where Trump leaned, and I was struck. It's the old quote of Voltaire, isn't it? The perfect is the enemy of the good. And I was struck by some of the pro-life leaders in America clearly did not like Harris for obvious reasons, but were disappointed that in this case Trump and the Republicans weren't perfect and in complete agreement. And for what my view is worth in these spaces, I think that incremental change is often really, really important, rather than completely bagging those who are still trying to do some good. I don't know how you found it in your space. I certainly did politically, that not only am I fighting pro-choice advocates, you're also fighting a rearguard action against some people on your own side who just don't think you're perfect enough. It's like, oh, good Lord.
Yeah. I often talk about, you get the arrows from the front and the back, and that's not unusual. And I get it. I mean, I think you've got to have the humility to say, oh, look, well, I made a bit of a mistake there. I didn't quite get that right ourselves. But at the same time, it does seem that there is perhaps an obsession with a perfect politician that doesn't exist anywhere. that people think you can have. And it's not like, we're in a very, you've got to understand the cultural situation, I think, too, we're in. I think one of the things that Ryan T. Anderson pointed out, and I think this is really, really apt in his essay that I was referencing earlier, is he mentioned, well, in actual fact, what we're seeing in the data is that a lot of Americans were willing to say, yes, I'm pro-life, and they would even turn out to marches and other things when Roe wasn't under threat. But the moment Roe was overturned, some of them actually showed that they weren't really committed once they had to have skin in the game. It was easy to stump up when there was no skin in the game, when you could have abortion on demand. But once that got taken away, some of them pulled back. And so there's clearly an issue there of actually engaging with and educating. Like, you've got to do both, and you've got to have legislation, but you've also got to engage with the public and help them to see, here are the moral truths and here are the moral lies that you've been told. And what I'm seeing that's very positive is more and more people are starting to do one of two things. You're seeing people, for example, like Bill Maher, who has traditionally always been pro-choice, who's come out on his show a couple of months ago and he said, look, I actually respect the pro-lifers who don't equivocate, those who are really clear and who are opposed to abortion and want it gone. He says, because that is a consistent position. And he said, at the same time in that show, he said, look, those pro-choicers who are trying to pretend that this is not killing, it is killing. He said, I'm okay with it. And he's kind of honest about that. And that sort of forces us then into a situation where we can have an honest debate about the realities of it. And of course, the flip side is I've seen others who are starting, these are pro-choice people, and some very, even like celebrities, who are starting to now say, well, look, I've had enough. I have my limits, and these people are trying to drag me into a pro-abortion extremism that I don't want to be part of. We've got to be willing, I think, to engage with and accept and welcome those people as much as we can, and not say, oh, well, I'm sorry, you don't accept everything yet, therefore you're not good enough.
Yeah, and that's only completely agree with you. It's something I would certainly echo. It's not that myself or others in this fight are needing to be perfect, but yeah, it's the people who very much, you need to agree with us 120% or else we'll reject you. It's like, whoa, could we just maybe get 80% in agreement? Like, this is good that we've got some synergies here. But I like what you say too about that, particularly in America, but it's here in New Zealand, it's got so extreme, the pro-choice or the pro-abortion side, that it's actually burning off some good people, actually, and in a way that's helpful for the discussion to be had. And you know what? Maybe that's one of the ironies coming out of the presidential election and Harris's obsessive focus on this topic, that it may actually bring about better, deeper conversations between the pro-life and actually the more moderate pro-choice people and bring about real change.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think it's interesting because I think there is a clear demarcation. I've been thinking about producing some commentary on this recently, actually, because it seems clear to me now that there is absolutely a pro-life camp, and then there is a group who would call themselves pro-choice. I always refer to that group as pro-abortion choice because I like to be clear and honest about what the choice is they are pro. And then there is the pro-abortion group, and they are a very clear, demarcated group now. I remember when I first started working in the space, it's been 20 years now, and I remember it was about 15, 16 years ago when the pro-abortion ideology first started to rear its head. And it was actually a group of feminists in Canada who had published some pamphlets and a poster that for the first time, I think in sort of recorded memory, a group was publicly saying that it doesn't matter whether or not it's a person in a womb or not. They said that's irrelevant. It would still be okay to end its life, even if it is a person. Now, that was a radical shift. Now, that view has now become quite normal amongst that particular group. And so there is a clear demarcation. And so I think we've got to be willing to have that conversation. And I think what you see is the door will open. But what we don't want to do is compromise our own truth and the truth in the process and our own position by sort of thinking, well, maybe we'll surrender some ground. No, it's always a movement towards trying to save lives and reduce acts of violence in our society because and I know that you know this, Simon, but I can't understate just how serious a crisis it is to have at the very heart of your culture and your system of quote-unquote rights an act of violence that actually deliberately ends the lives of an entire class of innocent persons and treats them as property effectively. That you can't say that's just consigned to the people who make the choice to do that. Our whole society is affected by that particular form of darkness.
Oh, 100%. And perhaps a deeper discussion for another day, because ultimately what you just described is a sign of a culture that's going to destroy itself. And it'll, yeah, because there's no hope, there's no sense of life or purpose or value. And so in many ways, I'm not surprised at the wider troubles that we have currently in New Zealand society and across the Western world, be it more suicides or violence, family breakdowns, drug use, etc., etc., etc. If you have a culture that doesn't value the unborn, or the fact of actually having children and families.
Well, the law is pedagogical. It is a teacher. The Greeks understood this. Wise societies understood this. And Mother Teresa, decades ago, put it beautifully when she said, look, if you accept the violence of abortion, you are teaching people that they can use violence to get what they want. And that doesn't just apply to that particular issue. And we have a tendency to view this purely in sort of bureaucratic managerial terms, and we go, well, you know, what are the flow-on effects, the bad effects of abortion, as if somehow you could stop the bad effects, abortion would become okay. No, it's actually much deeper than that. There's a whole philosophy, there's a whole way of treating human persons that is being taught to an entire culture, to an entire society. And you're right, that will manifest and expand outwards. And I think that's a big part. I mean, leaving aside the obvious fact of the suicidal nature of, you know, the very fact that you are not just destroying your own children, but your own society's future is represented by the gift of that new life, and it's all being abandoned. So there's so much embroiled in it. Oh,
there is. And it, again, a fascinating space to actually explore. So something we should come back to, actually, because my mind is whirring now. But I just thought that we might wrap this little discussion out by bringing it back to New Zealand in very practical terms, because a couple of weeks ago, Pharmac, so the drug buying agency here in New Zealand, as you know, but for some listeners to understand, is now providing test kits to ensure that the medical abortions done at home is done successfully. I just wonder if you've got any reflections or thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I just can't believe that this is happening. It's an expansion of an already seriously disastrous policy that came on the heels of Jacinda Ardern's Extreme Abortion Legislation Act 2020, whereby they introduced an 0800 dial an abortion service. And what this is effectively, I mean, and there's so much awful irony in this. The very same people who constantly claim that we'll have dangerous backstreet abortion deaths if we don't have extreme abortion laws are the very same people who introduced a DIY abortion service. Effectively, it's a backstreet abortion service, except you ring the government and they will send you the drugs, you do it yourself at home. And now they have added to that insult to injury by they are now funding and sending women the test kits to make sure that the abortion actually has achieved its aim of ending the life of the unborn child. This is all done at home. But what this does is this creates a situation where, A, we've got vital healthcare funding that is going to this. And secondly, there is, even if you're someone who's pro-choice, you should be opposed to what's going on here, because we know that mifepristone and mifepristone, the two drugs that are used in these chemical abortions, that this is a higher risk form of abortion, what is sometimes called a medical abortion. It's a chemical abortion. It comes with higher risks. And so when you are encouraging women to do this at home, you are actually exposing women to danger. And I hate to say this, but the tragedy is I think it is only a matter of time before we hear about a case of a New Zealand woman who dies as a result of this kind of policy. And I say that because if we could go back again just to the American election situation, some people might remember that the name Amber Thurman was mentioned quite a bit during the campaign by Harris and Waltz, and he brought her up specifically during his debate with J.D. Vance, the vice presidential debate. And Amber Thurman was a young woman who died after having an abortion using this very method. Now, they claimed it was because of abortion laws that killed her. It was nothing of the sort. She was killed by the abortion drug that was administered in an unsupervised fashion. And also, the hospital then didn't act and provide proper medical care. So you had malpractice on top of bad practice and bad policy. And the irony here is that it was the Biden administration, which Harris was part of, which removed the requirements for basic medical screening and supervision using that particular abortion method. And that is why she went home took the drug, goes home, and then gets the infection and dies eventually as a result of this. Now, if those screening and those supervision procedures had been in process around this medical abortion, that is almost certainly would not have happened. Now, the thing is, we've got that same situation set up now here in New Zealand. And so the sad reality is it's probably only a matter of time before we hear about a tragic case of a loss of life here as well.
I share that too, and I think it will be very tragic if and when it happened. I mean, statistically, it's going to happen. I mean, you've highlighted for me what are the two problems with Pharmac's decision. One is, of all the healthcare issues, of all the demands we have for pharmacological products at the moment, that was the choice. I mean, we all know Pharmac doesn't have enough money. Doesn't matter if you're a politician, media or otherwise, everyone's crying out for more money, and yet it wasn't cancer drugs, wasn't things for diabetes or for children, it's abortion testing kits. But it's that second part that you really drilled into, which echoes for me, which is it indicates how dangerous these in-home chemical abortions are, that such tests are required. So it's sort of, in some ways, Brendan, it's Pharmac in this case, and the pro-abortionists sort of saying the quiet bit out loud.
Yeah. Well, can we also talk about the devil's arithmetic in this, Simon? Like you've talked about those other drugs. Remember Keytruda and the cancer drug, that very effective cancer drug, which took the fight that went on over that. And yet here we are, again, I think a very unwise funding decision. But if you do the devil's arithmetic, guess what? It is cheaper to actually fund the deliberate ending of an unborn child than it is to actually put care into someone else, like with life-saving treatment. And that's the devil's arithmetic, that people just need to accept that we are driven by market forces in ways here that are not good. And this is precisely why we need to have a return to a Christian vision of reality which says the dignity of every person matters. And we talked about this before. You erode that dignity at the very fundamental level, in your most vulnerable state inside your mother's womb, then guess what? That filters outside the womb as well.
Oh, and it won't surprise you that devil's arithmetic is playing out in the euthanasia space now. We've got people, advocates here in New Zealand, saying it's cheaper to euthanize someone than to give them palliative care. It's like, oh my God. But before we run down the rabbit hole of euthanasia, we better wrap this discussion up here. Brendan, I am so grateful for your time and insights. But only one last question. If people want to engage more with you and the work you do, how do they get in touch? Because I know you're on Substack now, you have your podcast. How do people best get in touch with you?
Well, probably the best way is actually they can go to Watch LFM, that's watch as in look, Watch LFM for Left Foot Media, and all of my various content like the podcast episodes that go up there, they are published there and you can get notified. The Dispatches is the name of my podcast, and also I'm on Substack now there as well. And so trying to produce a new piece of written content each week, and I produce regular content most days of the week for the podcast as well.
Brendan, you're a champion. I love your voice into this space, and look, thank you for coming on to Family Matters.
Simon, it was my pleasure. It's always good to be with you, my friend.